All right, we are recording now. Okay, so this is the SIG Auth meeting of January 8th, 2020. This is our first meeting of the year. So Happy New Year, everyone. It's been a little while since we last talked. We do have a pretty decent amount of discussion topics, so I'll try to keep everything moving. So let's get started with the KubeCon recap. Tim had originally put this on here. I know he had, I think, some particular items. Mike, was there anything in particular from the theme of 2020 that you wanted to bring up for our goals?
No. I would say continue to push things to GA, try to close out some of the KEPs that are ongoing, certificates, all the token stuff, figure out what to do with PSP, and help people solve authorization authentication problems.
I like the genericness of that. That way we're not too committed to any particular thing.
What are you talking about? There are very specific things in there.
Yeah.
They're extremely specific.
Yeah. But no, I'm looking forward, like I know like at one of the last items was David's stuff on CSR API. I'm very much looking forward to moving these things forward. All right, so Alex is on the call. So this was, I think, on the agenda from last time, and we had ran out of time to discuss these things. So I think I wanted to bring them up. So Alex, you had made this PR to expose configuration for the envelope encryption. And then I think I had concerns around actually exposing that low level of granularity. So I was just trying to like migrate to GCM if we thought it was better. But as part of that discussion, Mike, you had brought up that we could do more drastic things like something altogether better.
Right. I need to page this back in. I think there are. I don't really like our ad hoc encoding format for secrets as they sit encrypted in etcd. I don't think it's flexible. There are standards for doing it better, and we're doing this encoding, storage encoding migration once. So I was wondering, if we do this, is there any way that we could set ourselves up to do it again in a easier fashion?
I mean, I think if we're adding things now to, in the future, support a different encrypted encoding format, then thinking about what that should be shaped like and whether we should use a standard one is like, now is the right time to ask that question.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think even if it wasn't necessarily flexibility that we could gain, I do like the idea that like if you had like an encrypted set of data from etcd, you might have a chance of being able to use a standard tool. You know, like I think you'd have to still like probably trim off prefixes for
Right.
values, but that's probably, sorry about that. That's probably okay-ish. That's probably within some reasonable scope of like, you know, trim these bytes off, and then you have a payload that is, you know, a well understood spec that someone can do something with. That seems like a nice property to have for something like this. I like tried to go back and like figure out how we got here, and it kind of just seemed like it happened organically. Like we had like entry KMS stuff, and we moved it out using the KMS API, but the entry stuff initially had this ad hoc method of encoding things. I don't know, maybe I got that wrong, but that was
yeah. So I think standard would be good, but some of the stuff that annoys me today is like we're doing like custom unspec'd length encoded we have this length encoded format that with some random prefix. Yeah, you spec'd it out. That should never have existed, in my personal opinion. We could have like created a protobuf wrapper and that given it a version, and I think we would have been in a better situation to make this migration because I don't know. This format scares me a little bit. I think CMS is an option. I probably wouldn't recommend JWE. It does add a lot of scope to what we're talking about changing in this specific change. But I don't know. Since this is going to be it's already going to be a 2-release migration, right?
Yeah, no matter what, if we want to be able to reasonably downgrade back.
Yeah, because you have to be able to read.
It has to be. You have to be able to skew and read. So yes.
Yeah, those are my thoughts on it. I'm not super invested in it. However, I'll let you decide what to do, or I'll let others decide what to do here.
For the originating issue about switching which encryption method, are we happy unconditionally switching to the new method?
Well, we're switching for just the data encryption cipher, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay. Did the discussion that led to that get documented? Because I know that was discussed originally, and somehow we ended up with the CBC method. And I just want to make sure that we like document why we're switching.
I thought we only had problems with it for the key encryption cipher due to non-street use.
Yeah, that's the only thing I know about CBC is since you can't know exactly how you're going to with GCM since you can't control the amount of writes you do, you have issues there. But since we only ever do 1 write per key and it's a random key, that went away. And I did ask my friends who actually know crypto better than me, like, does this make sense? Okay. The general gist I got was it probably doesn't matter either way. It's not necessarily a big deal in this. But don't use secret box because it's not FIPS compliant. Even though
nice. I just want to make sure that we document what we do and why back into the design or around the docs for the feature, just so we don't have the same discussion in 6 months when we all forget this.
So I mean, I guess the meta question though is, do we want to do either one of these things right now at all, or do we just write a KEP or whatever and say, okay, here's the encoding format we want to move to, and let's move to that and not worry about like exposing knobs or migrating right now.
You guys hear me? This is Alex.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you very quietly.
Oh, okay, sorry. I just wanted to bring up another issue related to the ability to delete data from etcd when the key is no longer available. I think when I started thinking about what that would look like, and I quickly realized that we would need to sort of rethink how much we encrypt. Basically, today we encrypt the whole envelope, including the metadata section, which is the crux of the problem. Basically, if you cannot decrypt the whole packet, the whole payload, you're basically no longer able to do anything with that piece of data.
Yeah, because finalizers can be involved in the delete path,
yep.
And we don't know what the finalizers need access to. It's not just metadata.
Well, technically, finalizers are on the metadata, but and you get a lot of mileage out of just being able to check them and ask. Why wouldn't we just tell someone, if you end up in this state, clear out the record in etcd directly?
That's a good point. That's a good point. Like in the environment that I'm in, unfortunately, I can't tell my customers to do that because they don't have access to etcd.
If you're in an environment where the configured storage, like the same degree of control that lets you fix a problem with your encryption provider is the same level of access that you need to go fix issues in etcd. Like if you got into this problem via the API and couldn't get out of it, then that would make more sense to me. But this means you got into this problem because basically your storage configuration went sideways. And so
not exactly. There is a slightly subtle case with key rotation, which brings me to another issue. So imagine you have a cluster that where you set up key rotation to be, let's say, every week. So the key gets rotated, and over time you accumulate data in etcd that is encrypted with different versions of the key. The issue today is that the customer, by just simply via Kubernetes, cannot tell which versions of the key are actually have been utilized and still in place.
Yeah, so the responsibility for managing that, I would say, lies with whoever configures the KMS.
Yeah, whoever decides to rotate basically knows that he needs to do a read-write cycle.
Yeah. So if the person setting up the etcd configuration points a KMS at a system that rotates without regard for whether data is still encrypted, needs to be decrypted using the old keys, I think that's a flaw of the KMS configuration and should be solved by that at that level.
But do you think it's an issue that we cannot? So the problem is with billing. So many KMS providers, cloud KMS providers, charge you for key versions. So it's a very legitimate use case for a customer to go and clean up the keys, versions of the key, which the customer believes are no longer in use. But there is no way to tell by looking at the secret object what version of the key was actually used. So
but Alex, in that case, why wouldn't you just then run a blind storage migration? Just do it.
We can do that, but it may become expensive, both computationally and from a billing point of view, because you basically.
Well, I mean, less expensive than losing the secrets.
Yes,
that's true, but
I think, I mean, I'm talking like. I'm trying to represent the customer here because I actually have customers that got into this scenario, and they are very surprised by the fact that they cannot delete the key, cannot delete the secret, even after the fact.
Yeah.
And they're surprised by the fact that they cannot tell what versions of the key can be safely deleted. And I acknowledge that maybe part of this responsibility lies on KMS somehow.
No, it's the responsibility of the thing managing the KMS, right? So like on this call, you have at least, I think, 4, maybe 5 people who have actually written the logic to automatically manage KMS, who understand that a storage migration is required before trying to clean keys, who know the complexity involved in doing that, but can still look and say that if you're going to try to manage the KMS configuration on behalf of the customer, it's the responsibility of the person managing that KMS configuration to ensure that they run the storage migration to allow retirement of old keys.
So basically your recommendation is to write a mechanism as part of the KMS plugin, for example, to detect key rotation on KMS and basically blindly rewrap all the secrets in the background. Is that what you suggest?
I would say that whoever writes the KMS configuration used by I'm thinking through. So now it's down inside the KMS plugin aspect. Whoever's programming that, yeah, they should know.
They don't. Today, KMS plugin only gets some bytes. It has no clue as to. Anyways, I think. I mean, I could be convinced. Like
I think that there's a large portion of Kubernetes deployments where the cluster administrators are not necessarily the operators of clusters. And speaking of the managed offerings, there is a benefit to many customers to give them control over keys. We would be doing a disservice not to consider the deployments that are constrained in this way, where there's a shared responsibility model. That said, is it like inconceivable that we hoist metadata necessary for deletes into some attached data when we do this encryption?
You don't.
Go ahead. Sorry.
You can get some mileage out of that, right? Like if you pulled out name, UID, resource version, and finalizers. But you don't know whether any of the individual finalizers are going to go through and say, I need the secret data content to make a decision about what action I need to take as a finalizer, right? And so you can get some mileage out of it, but it's not generically complete.
So
But
I mean,
it's sufficiently
can I ask a question though? Like we keep saying we can't delete the secret. I'm much more upset that I can't read the secret.
Well, so consider the case for service token controller, right? So it will blow up entirely because every single list of when it's watching secrets is going to return 500s from the API. Actually, most lists in all namespaces of secrets will return 500s because one secret is not unencryptable. So this renders the cluster pretty unusable. Gets will continue to work if you remembered what your secrets were named. In general, they're not discoverable. The cluster gets into a pretty messed up state in this situation.
Yeah, but I can't get it. How are you going to decide you want to delete it? I mean, I guess if you can read the etcd data directly, you can know that you want to delete this particular one. But like we're trying to solve something where you can't get the object anymore, but you know which one you want to delete, but the data you get isn't there.
I think the point is that potentially encryption. My take, and I've talked to Alex about this, is that potentially storage encryption was the wrong thing that we needed specifically for secrets. And we needed encryption of the data payloads rather than of the full object.
Yeah.
I mean, like I want my metadata encrypted too, so I don't have to remember what was important.
I mean, see also a client-side apply. I guess if you can't read this object via the API, how do you know this is one they want to delete without then actually being able to query it directly from etcd anyway?
Because I can't unencrypt it. And returning 500s is strictly from lists which break all informers is for all controllers is a
No, I'm trying to think like mechanically. Like let's imagine I had the ability to delete this. How did I figure out I needed to delete the secret foo without going direct to etcd?
I think the list error tells you what key failed.
You can do it one at a time. Okay.
Yeah. It's not awesome. Now, so I'm a little confused. I remember the last time I read the list code, it would like blindly keep going.
I would have thought that would be what Clayton did, but I don't know.
Like I remember Clayton writing it that way, and I was really stressed about it because it didn't look right, but I left it alone. Did someone go fix it by making it hard fail?
Yeah, I fixed that.
Awesome. Thank you. Now you have this a great functionality where you can't read partially.
It seemed like it would have been better at the time.
I mean, you're not wrong. It's worse to say here's a list of everything and it not actually be everything, and then things pop up later.
Yeah, because then I don't have to create it. I'm sorry, this already exists. Like I understand. I understand it's a rock and a hard spot. I guess I do look at this though. It really does look like just go to etcd.
Like part of the problem here is the KMS API effectively lets you touch things that weren't meant to be touched by you, right? Like we were supposed to control how we wrote things to etcd. The fact that it was etcd at all was a thing. Like all of this was supposed to belong to the API server, and we gave you this really low level control on how you contort bytes and stuff. And now you are telling us that you're in the critical path of us reading and writing data, but you don't know how anymore because you lost.
I buy the argument that because this is something that is configured on the API server at the storage layer, then it should require going directly to etcd. I'm not necessarily satisfied with it, so I'm just kind of looking for alternatives.
Is there? I do want to time box this because there were some things towards the end of the agenda I would really like to get to. But would it be worthwhile to see if, especially if we're talking about how we store things, like having a way to associate key IDs or some method so that a provider that wanted to have a repair or reconcile or some sort of function that was really low level could scan etcd and identify keys associated, or etcd keys that were associated with no longer available KMS keys. I don't think this is a normal thing that we want to expose via the API, but if there was something that a managed provider could do that would sweep and say, like, these KMS keys are gone, I know that you need these IDs, and the only reasonable thing to do is to actually just delete them.
I think that would be worthwhile, and I think it would be a lot easier if we had a better encoding format.
Okay. Let's can we make a note of that as one of the things to consider in the format discussion?
So
yeah, I would second that that's something we'd definitely be interested in. Is we're like, I mean, we're in the managed provider space, so asking customers to do a two-phase, hey, start, and then you rewrite all the secrets, and then we'll complete is sort of an awkward API.
To be clear, what I'm describing is not a good scenario. That's you deleted a key you shouldn't have, and you just suffered a ton of data loss. Like that's not the happy path.
Yeah, like to the point of what we're saying, right? Like what we mean the correct path is you provision a new key, right? And you call that your new write key. You do a force rewrite, and then you do provision the old key. There's no downtime. There's no data loss. There's
the key putting the key ID in the etcd format would let you do rotations in the happy path and like clean up deletes in the unhappy path.
I think there is a disadvantage to this bulk re-encryption rewrapping approach because it kind of defeats the purpose of gradual key use. Like basically, one of the ideas of key rotation is to limit the amount of operations performed by the key. If we basically, every time we rotate a key, we re-encrypt all the secrets in etcd, we basically kind of defeat that purpose of the key rotation.
You don't have to trigger the rotation every time you create a new key. You could trigger the rotation prior to removal of the oldest key. So it depends on how you want to do it, certainly. But if you are going to create a new key with the expectation that you can remove the old key, then you need to re-encrypt everything.
I completely understand it, but I'm just looking from perspective of like a managed cloud provider where key versions are cost money to customers, and I think it's a reasonable desire for them to implement some sort of cleanup mechanism. I think today there is no good way to do this, it seems to me.
Can we time box this and move on to the next item? All right.
Yes. All right. Okay. I don't know this person's name, but we were having a discussion about extracting credential providers. I think Tim was primarily the one commenting on this. Did anyone else?
I left a couple comments.
I think I only scanned this. Mike, do you have an idea of like what this? Let's see, who's this person?
Yeah, I don't think Nick is here.
Yeah, I pinged him. He didn't respond. I can maybe speak a little bit to this, but
Sure.
well, I know that we're working on to extract the entry cloud provider aware credential mechanism, right? So I don't know how far Nick got on this. I'm looking at the issue now, actually. Mike, have you talked to Nick about this one?
Yeah, it's essentially, if you are all familiar with the Auth exec plugin and the Docker credential helpers, then this is like the child of those two things. It is basically it proposes a config API group for similar to the exec auth plugin API group that will be used to feed registry credentials to the kubelet to pass down to CRI to pull images. Seems reasonable. I think the motivation is to remove package credential provider from entry and re-implement most of those credential providers in cloud provider repos or Docker registry provider repos. There were some alternatives that seemed less ideal. Overall, I think it's reasonable. I wouldn't want to reuse the existing exec plugin API group. I think this should probably be a separate API group in kubelet, maybe, or yeah, probably maybe a kubelet API group. Other than that, it seems reasonable if this is something that somebody wants to spend time to work on.
I think my main question on this one was whether the kubelet should be handling this at all, or if we should just push it down into the image service API. I think right now we do sort of a mix. There's like some things that the runtime figures out, and there's some pieces that the kubelet provides. And so I'd like to make that more consistent and either push it all down into the image service or pull it all up into the kubelet.
Yeah. So I think since this is existing functionality, we have to decide what we want more to remove entry cloud provider dependencies or move this down to the kubelet, because or move this out of the kubelet entirely. I think that's going to take a longer time potentially.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
I added Clayton to the poll. I know he had looked into various approaches to this and might have some thoughts. So.
We will always probably have some credential support in Kubernetes due to image pull secrets and whatever we decide to do there. I guess we could just punt on the default credentials and say this is something that you have to configure on your container runtime.
Yeah, I mean, right now it's relatively opaque, like as far as the person defining the pod is concerned. Like it goes to a node and the node gets its credentials however it gets them. It happens to be hard-coded using cloud APIs in the kubelet. But if that was instead done inside the container runtime, I'm not familiar enough with the container runtime to know if that would at all be reasonable, like if it has the information that it needs to make the same kinds of decisions. But yeah, if we can keep it contained to either the kubelet or the container runtime, that would be my preference. I don't want to surface API stuff for this just for portability reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So I would lean on SIG node mostly to like say what is a sane place to put this.
Yeah, compatibility for somebody writing one of these plugins, or I guess compatibility for somebody who has a Docker registry that they run with different container runtimes is nice, and it's something that we get today with the current structure. In that it doesn't matter if you're using Hyper or Docker. You write a credential provider once in the kubelet, and it works everywhere. But that doesn't mean that it needs to be standardized in the kubelet, just that standardization has been beneficial.
Okay.
I guess
I was going to ask, do we have like action items, or like, yes, more people could review the CAP and stuff, but what are sort of the things going forward that we want?
Maybe Micah can relay the discussion to Nick, and there's still some unanswered questions on the CAP. I guess we should make them take this to SIG node.
Yeah, I was going to just say, can we identify like a point person, ideally someone who knows both the node and the auth sides, to at least be the point person so this doesn't languish. I think this is probably the trailing edge of the things that would still require in-tree cloud provider dependencies. So just because it's getting such a late start. So I would really like to see at least a plan for this. Otherwise, even once the other cloud provider stuff, extraction stuff wraps up like into this year, this will still be requiring things. An alternative as well, which I think we talked about in one of the linked issues, some of the credential providers that are cloud specific don't actually use the cloud SDKs. They just like hit metadata endpoints and do things much more lightweight. So it's worth asking if that's a possibility for some of the providers. And if it is, then that could be a good intermediate step that would let us drop like super heavy SDK dependencies.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Well, Tim has a lot on his plate, but you just described him perfectly.
Yeah, I'll take another pass at this.
Yeah. Also someone who's too like pleasant and too nice to say, are you crazy? Why would you give this to me? Which also sounds like Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
I think I'm already assigned on it. Yeah.
All right. Who added the next item to the agenda?
Tim, was that you? SIG Auth endorsed Qualitative PSP.
Maybe that was me.
It was. I think it was one of those things that got pushed from last time or something.
So this is something we've been talking about doing around the discussions of the future of pod security policy and some of the different alternatives that we're considering. And one of the things that came up in a few of those discussions was this idea that actually most organizations want just a small selection of like standard profiles. And so there's basically the privileged one, and the restricted one, and then maybe this intermediate default. And so, the idea we had was to publish essentially a recommended pod security profile, sort of with a qualitative description, and then have links to, this is what this actually looks like in pod security policy, this is what this looks like under gatekeeper, and anyone else that wants to add to that. And we can say sort of this is a standard way of restricting pods under these different profiles. And this would also be useful for things like Helm, so that a chart doesn't need to package up their own pod security policy. They can instead say, this app runs under the default profile or something along those lines.
I see. So it's less a pod security policy and more just like a pod profile. And you could implement that multiple ways, but
yeah,
it's a meeting point for people to describe their needs and policy authors for various policy mechanisms to like define sort of well-known profiles.
Yeah, it's sort of a cross between a like best practices documentation and actually providing some like some manifests that implement those best practices.
So providing the manifests that implement those best practices, how would we decide who put theirs in there? For instance, I'd like to put SEC in the list, right? It's very well developed. It's been well established. But I can imagine that the next guy would also want to.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm inclined to kind of punt on that for now and say like we would be fairly open, and if the number of profiles got too large, then we could think of some more strict criteria.
So would we have a finite less than 6 profiles and an implementation of each profile in PSP, OPA, and SCC? Or would we let each policy mechanism define their own set of profiles?
The idea was that the basically there would be a description of what the standard profiles are in terms of what they restrict. And that would be standardized across all the different implementations. And then you would have the equivalent profiles in each of the different implementations.
And I like it just from a best practices perspective. Like even if it was just a document that says like here are like 3 levels. Privileged can do anything. Restricted can only do these things, and it maybe is really locked down. Like even like don't run as root or something. And then some middle level, which is just the volume plugins that makes sense, but maybe relaxes the root mechanism.
Yeah. To be clear, I like the idea. I just I'm trying to imagine the next step of like, well, he got his in the doc. I'm gonna put mine in the doc.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, does it like if we document the policies themselves, do we need to like have like the implementations right there? Like, wouldn't it be nice to then, like, I don't know, ask Google, hey, where's your implementation of these policies? Hey, Red Hat.
Kind of, although from a user perspective, like, it's really nice for them to be able to say, like, hey, I'm developing a Helm chart. What does this mean? How can I actually get this and try it?
Yeah, pointers, policy mechanisms that support, like, are aware of these levels and have pre-canned implementations of these levels is really nice. This actually ties into a later agenda item. I don't want us to be like a gatekeeper, like hosting the manifests, really, but I'm fine with like pointers to Cube compatible policy mechanisms that are on board with like these well-known levels.
Yeah. So would these levels like live in like the Cube docs? Like, is that a good place?
Yeah. So that's kind of the follow-up question: is should this just be part of just be a documentation page of like some best practices in Cube, or would we have some repo hosting all of this? I'm kind of inclined to just say best practices documentation.
I think that's a really easy way to start, and there's a lot of benefit there, and you get to sidestep a lot of hard problems while still getting benefits immediately.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you use good verbiage and are very clear on what you are expecting, like ideally, you know, like it should be pretty easy to translate the requirements into something OPA, PSP, SEC can enforce.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
I think a high-level guidance is definitely a start, and then each project can then follow the same mechanism and provide better docs on as part of the individual projects, or deliver mechanism, whether that's a chart or YAML, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take a stab at writing up a documentation page with these.
Okay.
And try and get some eyes on that.
Okay.
There's a related one is also if we want to publish a best practices audit configuration. This has also come up, and whether that would live in a similar place.
I think having a reasonable starting point audit policy on the documentation for the audit feature is helpful.
Yeah.
I thought we already did. Maybe I'm misremembering. But yeah, I mean, giving users for complicated configuration things, saying, if you don't have opinions, this is a good place to start. That's really nice.
Yeah.
I would say that if you wire it up to say write to disk or something, you're going to want to like call out configure it here. Like retention varies wildly. I agree that you probably want metadata on these. You probably don't want content. That sort of thing makes sense, but
yeah,
it's easy to have an accident.
Are you saying things don't behave nicely when all of disk is full of audit logs?
I don't know who wrote that or who decided it would be a really good idea that we should always track it and read it back, try to pull gigs of data off a node.
You up, David?
Yeah, so we talked about this last year. It's gone through a couple review cycles. There were this is CSRs support for multiple signers. And at this point, I think I've gotten all except for a couple minor questions. And I went in the channel yesterday asking for additional comments and specifically tagged Mike Denise, who had a couple outstanding questions on the implementation PR and on the KEP itself. Do you want to talk through your questions, Mike, or do you feel like you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we have a decision on if we're going to, when we are going to break people who are using the certificates API, not break, require action from them?
I would prefer to do it during the beta phase. So especially if it is implemented in a way that they have an option to turn off the enforcement. So if we do it in an admission plugin and they decide they don't care about this, they can always turn off the admission plugin in their environment. But I think the beta phase is the appropriate time to make changes like that.
Mm-hmm.
That aligns with what I'd like to do. I would like to make changes like this extremely clear so that users aren't surprised by a change in behavior, and give them a means to either temporarily suspend it, so grant an RBAC permission to whoever they want, or to update the code that uses it. And I would say that this particular bit of code, if you wrote your own signer, is complex enough that we can reasonably expect you to understand how to interpret a string field.
So what that would look like is release notes with the option, laying out the options you have. Like if you want to keep all approvals the way they are and not benefit from this segmented enforcement, then as a cluster administrator, you can turn off the admission enforcement, and you miss out, but you also don't change any behavior, basically. If you're currently giving approval permission to users and you want to explicitly give them approval permission for the existing signer types, then I would expect we would have roles defined for those types, and you would grant those roles to users. And then from a signer perspective, the fact that we don't differentiate multiple signers today, I think I'm comfortable saying that means that if you're running a custom signer, you are also in control of the kube controller manager for the cluster, because you would have to customize its configuration to say don't run, otherwise you would get dueling signers. And so I don't think we generally have a case where end users who don't control the cluster configuration are running custom signers. So that's good. It means that there's knowledge and control over the kube controller manager and cluster config for people who are running their own custom signers today.
Yep. These are all good arguments why this is okay, and I think there are a lot of reasons why it's actually going to be beneficial in the long run. So if we're all happy, we should just document it and move on.
All right, I'll plan to make that update tomorrow. There was one other significant question. It was about whether defaulting the signer name was valuable in V1 Beta 1. I think this one question was also from you, Mike.
Yeah.
And I tried to describe why I thought it was valuable and why I thought we should do it. I wasn't sure whether I convinced you or not.
So I think my concern with defaulting, other than is this actually going to be useful, was around it would, if we did any special cases, it would exclude kubelet approvers from benefiting from those special cases regarding backwards compatibility. If we are going to bite the bullet and say people need to make a change to add an authorization policy, then we should make them add the authorization policy that they will eventually need. So I think that it is beneficial given what we just talked about.
Okay, great. Then we'll be able to release that. So barring comments on the KEP from people on this call, I'd like to push for making my updates tomorrow, squashing down, and then considering merge.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. I'm doing my final pass on some of the nits around like the specific authorization checks and things, but the shape of it I think is reasonable. So we can get those worked out. And some of those, if some of those get tweaked during the implementation, that's fine as well.
Yeah, it's fine. You saw that James Munley, I don't know if he's on here. Thank you.
Yeah,
has started an impl.
Yep.
Okay. Great.
Around Mike's point about having people write the authorization policies that they're going to end up with, is that a point in favor of also defaulting kubelet serving certificate signer name?
I don't know how.
I think it is an argument for that.
We put a very distinctive subject name, like system : node : I think the subject name is the same as the client cert. And the submitter is identified to be a kubelet. So that seems pretty compelling.
I'm happy to do it. I didn't include it because I didn't know how to reliably make that choice.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I'll add details. We had a recognizer for that at one point. It might have gotten taken out when we took out auto approval, but identifying it should be straightforward. And I would do the same thing with a kubelet serving certificate.
Okay.
One other question that I haven't actually brought up, and it's just occurred to me, is around the policy descriptions for each of the different signer names that we've got here.
Mm-hmm.
Should they be like enforced as in the signer and not the approver, but the signer should reject, like return an error in that apply function and like reject the sort of like policy? Or should it instead do what it currently does today, which is just overwrite and set, like force these values? I suppose like given the signer name is like named and defined and has those properties, it may be fair to say that we can just override those values if a user requests the wrong ones, but I'm not too sure.
I would have, well, my immediate reaction is I would let the signer choose how he wanted to behave.
Yeah, I would leave it up to the signer to define whether it is a reject or overwrite. For the 3 Kubernetes ones, we should decide and indicate which it is.
Yeah, I think
Right.
definitely.
And I think you did for some already, but we can sweep through and make sure it's clear which it is. The thing that I'm most sensitive to, especially for the Kubernetes ones, is what will be possible or difficult for external signers that want to basically answer or sign the Kubernetes IO requests. And so, James, your experience, like whether signers typically ignore, like pay attention to a few things and then just stomp the remainder, whether that's more normal or whether they typically reject things that are out of bounds. That might be helpful to know.
Yeah, I've seen both happen with different CAs. There's probably some other people in this call that have more of an idea of what's expected, but I've definitely seen both from varying CAs with different policy engines. So I think it's kind of a decision that we need to make. But like you say, the external, like the idea of an external signer for, I don't want to actually fault this because it is kind of different. The idea of an external signer for the internal Kubernetes.io signer names, I think there's something to think about there, especially around approvers too. But that's a fork, so I'll stop that there.
I would like to request. I would like it if the world, if these signers moved in a direction where the CSRs contained less and less, and the signers decided more and more. I think that would be preferable.
Okay, so that's more in favor of ignoring invalid requests so long as the signer name is appropriate and transparently overwriting it if the signer name says it's a kubelet client cert. And
yes.
So if you ask for this, you get this profile and you get these extended attributes and these key usages and this CA bit, and like this is just what you get.
Yes, and CSR is just the mechanism by which we transport up the public key.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense to do for these internal types. I think I wouldn't want to prescribe it as part of like the CSR spec as an implementer of an external thing.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, this is on like the top of my list for today, tomorrow. So let's give this attention and we can hopefully get the cap settled.
Since we got 2 minutes, can we go on the CSI driver real quick?
Yep.
All right. Let's see. Reader, you're on the call. So I think, Rita and myself, we've been talking a little bit, and I know Jordan had commented some on the thread. I think the general concern is kind of similar to the discussion around the PSP discussion we had just a little while ago. Like I have this feeling that there is like just a little bit too much centralization around the driver, and like in the world I was sort of imagining, right? The driver exists on its own, and it has like little links to where you can get providers, but like you deploy the driver by itself, and then you go get your providers and you add those as you want. But like the driver kind of works by itself without like it shouldn't necessarily like like we had discussed some of the command line flags and like how they enumerate like minimum versions of particular providers. That seems like a really tight coupling to me.
Yeah. So I did respond like just like before this call, I guess, and I totally understand the concerns. So I think just want to clarify, like, so today each provider can be deployed independently, right? And so I think the ask sounds like it's to remove the deployment of the providers from the driver, specifically the driver chart.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, one manifest that bundles up a bunch of different providers. I think there are scale issues there, especially like every time every provider does an update, we would need to update that chart and tag a release. So that works okay with 1 or 2 providers, but not great if there's a dozen or 50. And then the issue about like endorsement or quality, like basically it's a inclusion in that is a signal that this is an okay thing for you to use, and we either don't take responsibility for it and just accept it, anything anyone submits, which doesn't seem great, or inclusion gets blocked on sort of review and quality or legitimacy, or like that just seems like work that we don't have the bandwidth for.
Yeah, for sure.
So
I think this is an easy fix, right? I think it's easy to remove it from the chart, and then as for the provider compatibility and the parameter check for minimum version of the provider, like those are just nice to have that we put in place to give users better error message to tell them, hey, here's the minimum version you should be running. But what we could do is to make that check optional. So if the provider is not part of that flag, we can just like let it naturally call the provider binary and fail, and then users can still see the log, right? Why it failed, but it just won't be like a nicer message. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, the more generic and agnostic the driver can be to the provider that's running on top of it, the better. So if there's a generic mechanism that would say, like, here's the version I am and here's my version range, and then in the provider's manifests, they can invoke it with a specific parameters and it does a check, that's fine. I just want to avoid particular providers embedded in the driver. So
yeah, I mean, like what I had imagined was almost like a bit of a handshake between the driver and the provider, right? Like the provider understands like v1, so presuming there weren't no breaking changes in that, you can use v1. But if it sees that it's being called from v2 or something like that, like it could preemptively say, okay, this one isn't supposed to work. We made these breaking changes. This one isn't officially saying it supports them. We shouldn't even call out to it or something.
I know we're over time. That was the only remaining concern I had. It sounded like Mike and Michelle were happy with where things ended up. There's maybe some cleanup stuff to do after the move, but nothing long. So I just wanted to have this conversation before we bring in the and it becomes like an attractive sort of first party, like here's the official manifest thing. So
yeah, I mean, really appreciate the feedback. I think it's good suggestion, and we'll make the change. It should be pretty quick.
Okay. All right.
All right, we are over time. Thank you everyone for attending. We will see you in 2 weeks.
All right. Thank you.
Bye guys.